see many crime victims, but even the police chief was affected this week when speaking of a carjacking victim and saying, "That could have been my mother." This time the weapon was a knife, but throughout the region there has been the echo of gunshots. We will look tonight at crime and what's going wrong. Our other story this week is the legislature, which closed its annual session on Thursday. We'll survey the legislative successes and evaluate the performance of the governor and key legislators, and we will discuss the loosening of marijuana laws. Those stories, plus adjusting to an anticipated post-COVID era, are topics for tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Stephanie Grace, political columnist, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. Pike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. And Tyler Bridges, a reporter for the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. All righty, guys. Let's start with Mike first and talking about the story that just really has the community upset. A tragic carjacking incident this week, where a woman was stabbed to death. An arrest has been made, but there are a lot of questions involved.
Yeah, and this is one of those horrific incidents that even amid a overall spike in crime, this one really hit the nerve of the community. We have a 60-year-old victim in a carjacking as she's leaving for work at 7:30 a.m. in the 7th Ward, a beloved member of the community, part of the long-standing drum circle at Congo Square. And to make it even worse, this was not a gun, armed robbery, and carjacking. It was she was killed with a knife, which is always somewhat more violent and an intimate crime. And police very quickly released some video footage from a surveillance camera. It became pretty clear that they were looking for this career criminal. 47-year-old Brian Andre had been in and out of prison, and what is really caused a lot of discussion and sometimes heated discussion is that he was in jail recently, both in Jefferson Parish and New Orleans. In New Orleans, in 2 different armed robberies. In Jefferson, a lesser charge, possession of stolen property. But he had a high bail that was reduced by a criminal court judge, Angel Harris. She's one of the new judges on the bench, and reduced his bail to $95,000, which is pretty substantial bail for most people. Cost about $13,000 to pay a bail bondsman, which he did, and got released. And on a couple of conditions, one being that he be placed on an ankle monitor, the other that he report to drug rehab. He did make a couple of Zoom court appearances after he was released, prior to the murder, and there's been no indication that there was a check or follow-up on whether he was even in drug rehab and really whether he even had an ankle monitor. For that simple fact to still be an open question, none of the usual ankle monitoring companies knew anything about this. So many questions from the bail reduction, and
Right.
It should be noted that under the previous district attorney, Leon Canizero, bail reductions were often contested by that office. Jason Williams has a different policy. He steps aside on matters of bail, and in this case, it was granted by the judge.
Okay, so it was reduced from $245,000, which had been set, $245,000, which had been set by the previous judge to hold that seat.
Right.
So the DA did not contest it?
Did not, at least nothing reflected in the docket master, which are the minutes of the court proceedings. But it is the stated policy of the DA's office not to contest bail at these, bail reduction hearings. It took a, hearing by the defendant's public defender to request this and state reasons why. What is on the docket that we know is that there were conditions of the ankle monitor and the drug rehab. We don't know if those things happen. Mm-hmm. So I know a lot of those judges, they maybe reduce a bail, add these conditions, but then they check up on the conditions and make sure to find out how the drug rehab is going. Obviously, somebody with this long of a criminal rap sheet with some very, very serious charges hanging over his head, you would think that there might be a more diligent check of whether he was meeting those conditions set by that judge.
Mike, what do we know about this judge? This was a brand new name that most people haven't even heard of.
Right. Well, she came from out of town and was able to she was among the slate of the flip the bench movement of more progressive judicial candidates. And despite being a relative unknown, just kind of got carried, with that wave of progressive reform, which included the district attorney, Jason Williams beating Kiva Landrum. And sure enough, from relative unknown to important seat on the criminal court bench at an odd time during the pandemic. We haven't had jury trials.
Right.
The court almost ground to a standstill, and a lot of these hearings were conducted over Zoom. And I must say that the media has been hampered because there are no live court hearings for us to attend and keep track of these cases. So we're relying on the computerized record
Right.
of the court minutes, like docket master, on what happened.
Let me ask you also, in posting bail, this suspect used a bail bondsman, correct, to post bail, which
Yes.
is a percentage then of the
Right.
whole bail. I think 13%.
That's right. It's 10%, and then the 13% fees on top of that.
Yeah,
13%
it brings
total.
it to 13%. So, but he did have a public defender. So, how does that work?
Okay, so that is, another interesting element of this case. Many of the judges, and there's no statute that requires this, but many of the judges, especially in Orleans, will say that if you're able to post a relatively high bail, that you are no longer eligible for a public defender's office, which is for the indigent. And you have to go through a process of filling out a form, declaring indigency with OPD, Public Defender's Office, in order to sort of requalify. But a lot of judges hold, hard and fast to that policy. Like I said, it is not a Louisiana statute, but it is widely used. Not used in this case, apparently. The defendant, Brian Andre, did continue to be represented by the Public Defender's Office. We see that in the subsequent court hearings held over Zoom, including one just last month. And what we don't know are, the elements of being on an electronic monitoring, if that was even done, and if so, what was he doing in the period that led up to this horrific killing, in which he is, of course, arrested and accused, but innocent until proven guilty.
Correct. All right. A lot of questions, like you say. All right. Thanks a lot, Mike. Okay. Legislative session, regular session has ended. Title, let's go over to you to start with the overview of what did they do?
Yeah. It's kind of an interesting situation. The legislature is majority Republican in both the House and the Senate. But the interesting thing that I want to point out is that what I would call the political center actually held this year in the legislative session that ended Thursday night. And by that, what I mean is that certainly Republicans got various things that they wanted, but the far right in the Republican Party did not. So the election restrictions that we've seen other Republican state legislatures, in other states, that did not happen this year. Efforts by the really conservative Republicans to, lock them up, really strong anti-crime measures, those did not sail either. Instead, we did see some continuation of the measures that have been passed in recent years to have fewer people put in prison, and those in prison that have an easier chance to get out. We saw the legislature approve a tax swap where people would get lower income tax rates in exchange for losing a deduction of their federal taxes on their federal payments on their state taxes. And that looks like that's something that the governor will sign into law, and that will be on the ballot on October 9th as a proposed constitutional amendment. We saw more money for teachers, and we also saw various measures that are going to expand gambling in the state of Louisiana. And on the infrastructure piece, I know that's something that Stephanie here is going to, I want to throw that over to her for a moment.
Right. That was something that came about at the end of the session. Of course, there have been efforts to increase the gas tax in Louisiana, which generally funds infrastructure. It's very low. It hasn't been increased in decades, and Governor Edwards has wanted to do it. Some legislators, Democrat and Republican, have wanted to do it. It's just been a non-starter politically. Tax increase, Republican legislature, as you said. So this session with, just horrible needs, big needs, a new bridge over the Mississippi and widening of interstate lanes, all kinds of things. There was an effort in the legislature, it really came out of the legislature, not the governor's office, which is interesting, to find a way to pay for it otherwise. So the first thing that happened is that they looked at, remember that temporary sales tax that was adopted in 2018, and with to get out of the fiscal, away from the fiscal cliff that really dominated legislative activity for several years, get beyond even this session, Governor Edwards' second session, and it's supposed to drop off afterwards. There was a move to extend it and say that money should go for infrastructure. That didn't fly. So then what they did, and what they did is they took a bill that was about medical marijuana originally and kind of hijacked it almost. And so what the legislature ended up doing is coming up with a different mechanism that was basically taking sales tax on automobiles, so related to transportation, a percentage of it, a very high percentage of it, and diverting that to infrastructure, to kind of a mega projects fund that would be for bridges, highway expansion, things like that.
Okay.
And going back to the idea of how the political center has ended up being perhaps the biggest winners this year, the governor ended up making a deal with the business leadership, where people who are on unemployment, their extended federal benefits of $300 a week, those will end on July 31st, scheduled to end on September 6th. So the deal with the governor cut with the business community is that those benefits will end on July 31st, and in exchange, as of January 1st, Louisiana's unemployment benefits per week, which are $247 per week, among the lowest in the country, or if not the lowest, they're going to go up by $28 a week. So the governor thought it was a good idea to cut off the benefits, which has happened in a number of states run by Republican governors, in exchange for down the road people getting higher benefits. So that was, again, another example of sort of the political center.
Tyler, let me ask you, are we getting Fed money for roads and bridges too?
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things that why there was good feelings in Baton Rouge was there was so much money that came down from the federal government, and then the irony is that Republicans were very eager to spend this money, which had been approved by President Biden and the Democratic Congress.
Okay, so let me ask you this, both of you. When we conclude a session, how did the governor do? How did certain legislators do? How did they come out of what they wanted in this session? Stephanie, start with you.
Well, I think the governor, it's so interesting. As Tyler mentioned, we have a Republican legislature, Democratic governor. This is really the first time, this is the first term where the governor has not helped select the legislative leadership. The legislature has really declared independence. So you have things like this transportation bill, which came out of the legislature. It's not clear whether John Bel Edwards is going to sign it, I'm going to tell you, even though he supports more money for infrastructure, of course, but he is concerned about the funding mechanism. He's concerned about another fiscal cliff down the road. So we don't know. So I think it's really important to look at vetoes coming down the road, some of which we know are coming. Tyler Russell mentioned some of the ideological bills that are going through in other conservative states. A few of them have gone through here. One of them is getting rid of training and permitting for concealed carry of firearms. One of them is banning transgender girls and women from school sports, K through 12 and also college. The governor has already said he's going to veto those, and the legislators knew he knew that when they passed them. So I think we are kind of entering a little more of a confrontational situation than we've had in the past.
Tyler, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that the House Speaker, his name is Clay Scheck-Snyder. He's a Republican from Gonzales. He's a guy who doesn't like to talk to the press. And he faced a difficult situation about 3 weeks ago during the legislative session where a conservative Republican from Chalmette, Representative Garofalo, was pushing the banning of critical race theory. It's an important conservative thing that's happened in other states, is to ban this schooling or this teaching. And Representative Garofalo was shut down by Speaker Schexnayder, who had originally allied with Democrats, and he was able to keep that coalition going, and he angered some of the more conservative Republicans in the House, but he was able to pass through the sort of choppy waters, and by the end of the legislative session Thursday night, everybody seemed to be in a pretty good mood. So it seemed to be a very good session in the end for Speaker Schexnayder, and also probably the President of the Senate, Paige Cortez, who's a Republican from Lafayette.
Real quick, any chance of a special session being called to override vetoes?
No.
Okay, no. Well, that's quick. Thanks a lot. All righty, thanks a lot to you both. E, let's go over to you and looking ahead now to life after COVID. What do you see happening?
Well, it's happening, and it's happening all around us, and there's more good news than bad news, but there's a little bit of confusion also. You know, the big symbol of recovery, as it was after Katrina, as it is now, is restaurants. You know, when people start going to restaurants and they talk about restaurants being open, that becomes a real mark for that. And the restaurants are full. I mean, if you've tried to go lately, that the reservations, I mean, you really got to make reservations ahead of time. By the way, if any of you are planning to go out Friday night, forget about it if you have reservations, unless you want to go at midnight or something, okay? And so that's a good sign. But you talk to the people in the restaurants, and they're still complaining about what they have been complaining about, that there's still a shortage of labor. So one reason they're full is they have fewer tables in some cases, but the activity is there, and people are out, they want to celebrate, they got that money, they got their shots, and they have all that. But I think another thing that we're going to see, and there was a sign today, this week of this, is things being moved around a bit. And an example of that was the Voodoo Festival. When they announced that they would not have a festival. They've always been on Halloween weekend, as they were going to be this year, and they're going to be in City Park. They did not give an official reason why they're not doing it. The press did check with City Hall, and City Hall said, "Don't blame us. We didn't say anything. They could have had it as far as we're concerned." But it has been noted how crowded October is going to be, where you have the French Quarter Festival. And then you have the Jazz Fest. The Jazz Fest assumes a lot of oxygen in the community, both financially and in terms of just people activity. And then you also have this thing called the Buku Festival. And so you're really heavy with festivals at that time. And then sort of an auxiliary problem is that this is happening all around the country, that festivals all around the country that haven't been held, you know, they're looking to be held around the same time of the year, and they're looking for bands just like everybody else. And so just a competition for bands and activity and people to go to the festivals. I could see, being a festival organizer, that you want to give it some thought, especially if you have Halloween weekend as your date. Usually it's a wonderful date. And then one more thing, which hasn't been mentioned, but I think it's a factor, is that on Halloween is when the Saints have a national television game against Tampa Bay. I think it starts at 3 o'clock. And so, I don't know, running a festival against that. And so, I was also in a meeting yesterday with about a tennis tournament that's being postponed for a year. It's been held for the last few years, but they're going to postpone it. And one reason is because the people who they usually rely on for funding just don't have money this year because they didn't make any money last year. So I think we're going to see a lot of things being repositioned and moving around. But overall, the movement is good. The movement is towards, you know, getting back to living again.
A lot happening, of course, French Quarter Festival in October as well, so a lot to do. All right, Eve, thanks a lot. Mike, let's go on over to you. You know, we know that there's a really bad carjacking problem now in Orleans, but also a number of shootings up, too.
Right. In fact, the categories of violent crime in New Orleans are all up, and in some cases pretty dramatically over the same period of 2020. You mentioned carjacking. That's probably the most alarming trend. They're up 117% from last year's numbers. And it does seem to be almost a runaway problem. And criminologists, police department are all kind of at a loss as to what are the factors involved in this spike. We know we're coming out of a pandemic. There's a lot of stress and perhaps, financial stress, but it's also just, formerly empty streets during the shutdown are now, busy with activity. People are returning to work. And, there's even warnings about, getting in and out of a car, avoiding certain neighborhoods. That's a dire problem. Now, as far as the murder rate, which is often, kind of a benchmark, an easily digestible number, it's up 30% over last year. But quite alarming is that non-fatal shootings are up 84%. And that's probably a more informative number, because any one of those non-fatal shootings could easily be a homicide if not for better aim, or maybe, the medical care or the, emergency room trip to the hospital, save somebody's life. So that is obviously, alarming. And we've heard Police Chief John Ferguson asked what he thinks is, contributing to all of these spikes, and he's at a loss. We know that the police department is down with manpower, and some other things are being pointed to that might have to be revisited. For example, part of the consent decree is a no-chase policy by NOPD officers. And I guess the unanswered question are, do criminals know this? Has it kind of seeped into that criminal realm to where they are now emboldened to take cars, knowing that, unless it's a kind of a hot scene after a violent crime, that for the most part, officers will not get the green light to do a car pursuit. So once again, I know that people are unnerved. Another factor is we've had a pretty dramatic, as we spoke about in the previous segment, a pretty dramatic shift in criminal justice policy toward more progressive measures, which means things like lower bail, and results in people like Brian Andrew getting a bail lowered, perhaps maybe not the tightest monitoring of the conditions of that bail, and some people are now taking a hard look at whether things have maybe swung too far too quickly, or at the very least without certain programs and other measures that are also part of the progressive agenda to keep a little more of a lid on crime.
Now, I've spent a lot of time in Baton Rouge recently covering the state legislature, and I know that crime is up in Baton Rouge, and in fact, I believe that crime is up across the country. And how much of it is a factor to the kinds of things, Mike, you're talking about in New Orleans versus the kinds of things that are going on throughout the country?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Tyler. And especially in big cities, urban areas, it is a national trend that crime is up. So people are looking at, what effects of the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, might play a role there. So, but in addition, layered on top of that, here in New Orleans, there are some other very sort of New Orleans-specific factors that have really sent our rates, 17% increase in carjackings, is far beyond any other big city that we compare ourselves to in the country. So there are clearly some very specific New Orleans factors. And for example, just one of the hot spots is Eastern New Orleans, the 7th Police District, which disproportionately takes the largest hit when there's a shortage of NOPD officers because of the vast geographic area that they have to cover. And people there say they go, hours and days without ever seeing a police officer. The criminal element catches on to that and thinks that, they get emboldened and more brazen to commit crimes, thinking that they're not going to get caught.
Yeah, we have to move on now, but you can just see the frustration in the chief's face. He definitely is frustrated. Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. Stephanie, over to you real quick. Now, we're seeing some shifting marijuana laws coming out of the legislature, but also attitudes.
And this is really, connected to this progressive movement in criminal justice, this idea that we've over-incarcerated nonviolent offenders, low-level drug offenders. So what happened, again, as I said before, this is something driven by the legislature, not the governor. The governor, who's always been an advocate for criminal justice reform, has been skeptical of loosening marijuana restrictions. But this year, a couple interesting things happened. the legislature considered a bill that was like the Colorado bill, basically, to legalize, sell, regulate, tax, all of those things. That did not pass, but it got a surprising amount of support from Democrats and Republicans. Then there was a second bill, and this is decriminalization. So where that's different is it doesn't mean you're going to have stores where you can buy pot legally, but what it means is that people who are arrested for possession or charged with possession of a small amount will not be arrested, will not face serious charges. They'll face misdemeanor charges. And that's something that's kind of already happened in the big cities in Shreveport, Baton Rouge, New Orleans. And it passed in the legislature. The governor, again, was not on board, was not part of the negotiations, but he has said he's interested in signing it. He hasn't declared he definitely will yet, but he certainly has indicated he will. And he's also said, look, I think we're probably going to have legalization in a few years. I mean, I can see that. I'm, like many people, am coming to terms with it and trying to understand it. So, you know, it's something that polls very well among people. It does well among younger people, including conservatives. The sponsor of the full legalization in the legislature was a guy named Richard Nelson from Mandeville, who's a very young Republican who says he doesn't smoke pot. It's not about that, but it's more kind of the libertarian instinct, I think.
So we're seeing opposition in loosening stuff. If we're gonna go to the remaining stories, the other stories, we got to move to it now.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
So I'm going to stick with you anyway. Thanks, Steph. But we're just about out of time.
Okay. Alaska Airways announced that it's in December. It's starting nonstop service to Portland 3 times a week, 2 flights a day, 3 times a week, seasonally.
All righty, Tyler.
Yeah, with the legislature ending the regular session, the issue ahead now for the legislature will be redistricting. I'm writing a piece on that, and that'll be the big news in the coming months. Is, you know, it's something that happens once a decade. All the lines will be drawn for the State House, Congress, the State Senate, and the Supreme Court.
It will be very interesting to see how that turns out. It's going to be a big issue. You're right.
Yeah.
Mike.
Yeah, on the topic of crime in New Orleans, look for state police troopers to be coming to New Orleans to supplement patrols, and not just in the French Quarter like they used to, but all over the city in an operation that they're calling just slips my mind from the.
But they're going to be here.
It's a new moment.
That's right.
Okay.
All righty. Steph, over to you real quick.
Okay, we have a special election on Saturday in Algiers, West Bank of New Orleans. Jefferson Plaquemines to replace Troy Carter, who, of course, in the state Senate was elected to Congress. There are 4 candidates, one of whom is a familiar name, Carter.
Okay.
Gary Carter, state representative, Troy Carter's nephew.
All righty. Thanks a lot, guys.
Okay.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for joining us, too. See you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.